Well, welcome back to the Miller Center for our last event of 2024. It's great to see so many of you here with us today, and for all of you online, thank you again for joining us. We're in the middle of a presidential transition, and as you know, we've already done one event here on the transition. We've done one in Washington. We'll be doing another one on January 13th, looking ahead at what is coming for the second Trump administration. But we thought we'd take a moment here as the year winds down to look back at the election one last time and put it in historical perspective. And as you all know, we have a terrific group of scholars here at the Miller Center who do presidential history. And we thought we'd reflect back on what echoes or rhymes in the last presidential election, the one that just happened, across history with previous presidential elections. We know that President Trump is only the second president to be elected after having lost re-election. But there are a number of other echoes in this election that we thought were worth considering, particularly as we look forward for what that tells us about what might happen in a second Trump term, what the political cues were that allowed him to win, and where he might see successes or troubles ahead as he navigates. So I'll quickly introduce the scholars that you all know so well, and we'll get right in it. Mark Silverstone is the Director of Presidential Studies. He's also the Gerald Baliles Chair, which is named after my predecessor, Jerry Baliles, and goes to the Director of Presidential Studies. He was preceded in that role by Barbara Perry, in both of those roles by Barbara Perry, who is now the Newman Professor here at the Miller Center and co-leads the oral history program with Russell Riley. And then finally, Guian McKee, who is the newly christened Miller Professor here at the Miller Center, named after, I think after White Burkett Miller. The center was founded by Burkett Miller, named after his father, White Burkett Miller, and Guian now bears that chair title here at the center, along with Sid Milkus. We have two Miller professors here. And Guian and Mark, as you know, co-lead the Presidential Recordings Program, listening to transcribing and studying the secret Oval Office recordings of primarily Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, but this year we're finishing tapes from the FDR and the Reagan secretly recorded interviews of the Reagan and FDR administrations. So with that, let's kick it off, and we're going to start with Mark about historical echoes. Lots of issues to sort through here. Echoes on the economy, on immigration, on crime, chaos in the world. We're all winning issues for Trump, and we've seen some of these in the past. But he also rebooted his agenda, including on fighting the administrative state and his perceived enemies. So that's a pretty complicated and brew is not the right word, maybe stew, right? There are chunks of different things in that gravy. Mark, what are you looking at, and what echoes from previous presidential elections?
So I'm glad that you said echoes and not analogies, because we always have to be careful when we're talking about that. History rhymes, it doesn't repeat itself, but there's enough to chew on, and you'd already alluded to one of those, where we have former president facing off against an incumbent president, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, and then emerging triumphant. Another one, another echo from 1968, in which you have a sitting vice president, Hubert Humphrey, taking over for the sitting president, Lyndon Johnson, who had decided not to run, and having a whole bunch of challenges, which we'll probably get into later on, and ultimately losing to Richard Nixon. But it is that year of 1968, for me, that stands out as maybe the most significant of those presidential echoes that we could consider. Think back to what was going on at that time. From the more placid years, let's say, at least on the surface, in the early 1960s, to where we were by 1968, as the Vietnam War, at least in the United States, certainly had generated a whole lot of dissent. And I'll say something about that broadly speaking, but certainly in the United States, a whole lot of dissent. The civil rights successes of the Johnson administration, 1964, 1965, ended up blowing up, certainly by the summer of 1967, with civil unrest. The country, it seemed, was coming apart, and certainly in '68 you have the assassinations of first Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. There seemed to be chaos in the streets and a real sense, particularly among a younger generation that had grown to political maturity after being born in the early post-war years. And that's a really significant matter here, this demographic change, that you have a whole bunch of people who are mobilized now against elites, against institutions, against the Cold War order, against the best and the brightest who had led for so long, and presumably we should be letting them do what they would do, because they are the ones who have gone to the best schools and they've had the jobs that would lead them to exploit their expertise. And all these things now, expertise, the best and the brightest, the elites, these institutions, they're also now coming under attack. Incumbents are coming under attack. And I focus on 1968 because that's a dynamic not only in the United States, LBJ himself having to leave the race as a result of the challenges of Vietnam, but globally. I mean, you have this in Europe, you have this in Asia, from Bangkok to Berlin, from the world at large. You had students largely, in many ways, also rebelling against this Cold War consensus and Cold War order, wondering about the capacity of their leaders to chart the way forward when they were getting very frustrated. And this is on both sides of the ideological divide, not only in the West, certainly in Western Europe, but in Eastern Europe, think Poland, think Czechoslovakia as well. So for me, 1968 stands as a marker.
And Nixon, though hadn't been president, had been vice president before in a time of peace and order, and also had a secret plan to end the war.
Had a plan to end the war. Never said he had a secret plan to end the war, but that's the way in many ways it was interpreted. He had a plan to end the war. And he could say so, just like Donald Trump could say, I'm going to end this war in Ukraine in 24 hours. And it's easy to say it on the stump, on the campaign trail, because you're not going to be really held to specifics until you get into office. And certainly once you get into office, you find out a whole lot that you didn't know before that changes your calculations. Certainly it did for Richard Nixon. Whatever plan he had initially ended up evolving such that he wouldn't end the war until the end of his first term in office. And again, it's a complicated story that we can get into. But my sense is that, like Richard Nixon, Donald Trump will find out that there are more challenges to ending the war in Ukraine than he'll be able to address in the first 24 hours.
It's really great. Barbara, so I'd love for you to reflect on the re-electing of Trump a bit. There's two ways to interpret a re-election, right? One, or this re-election, it's an endorsement of his past performance, or it's because the public felt that he was better than the alternative. Biden said, don't judge me against the almighty, judge me against the alternative. Once they started doing that, he stepped out of the race. And when Trump was judged against the alternative, at some level people chose. But how do you see this? And are there particular elections or re-elections that come to mind as you think about this one?
Well, let me answer the first, or try to answer the first question with the professorial answer of both, both and or.
Yogi Berra.
Exactly.
When you come to a fork in the road.
Take it. I won't go into Johnny Carson and the Slauson cutoff, but some people might remember that from one of his skits. Now, so is it that people thought that Trump was better than his opponent? You have to say that yes, if someone wins by even one vote, presumably more people thought that Trump was better or would be a better president this second time around than Kamala Harris. So I certainly think that there were people who thought that, and they might have thought on this issue of they liked what Trump had done in the first term. We know that 67 million people voted for him in 2020. So 67 million people thought he had done a good job in the first term. So we know that. And now he's added to that mix. I would also say that the old Reagan question, and so it makes me think a little bit of 1980, the famous question of Reagan in the debate with Carter, looking into the camera and saying very simply, to the American people, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And because of the issues dogging Carter, high inflation, very high mortgage rates, which I'd like to point out were almost twice as much as the highest inflation we faced under Biden, but just to say, that was, unless you were a saver like my dad who bought CDs at 10-year terms for about 15%, did quite well in that inflationary period. But obviously people were hurting, and then the Iran situation with the hostages, and Carter could not overcome that. So I think that whether people truly were better off, and I know we're going to talk about this next with Gian, so it's a perfect segue, whether people were truly better off under Trump, let's say, in the economy, or they felt more at peace, or they felt that the world was at peace, or whether they just felt that way, and it wasn't really true, it doesn't matter. If people feel that way, then they feel that way. And then I would just say about the other election, obviously, of 1888 and 1892, about Grover Cleveland, when we were running, thanks to Bill and Melody Barnes at the Karsh Institute, after these last two elections, so 2020 and 2024, Bill has gathered scholars together from the Miller Center as well as around the university to do look backs. What has happened in this 2020 race? What has happened in this 2024 race? And the first thing that I wrote for the blog after 2020 was, would Donald Trump be Grover Cleveland, Millard Fillmore, or Harold Stassen? How many of you remember Harold Stassen? You get a star if you remember Harold Stassen. I mostly remember that he became a punchline for Johnny Carson particularly, but as an also ran, but as an always running. And so it was the case. I thought, well, if Donald Trump doesn't become Grover Cleveland and win, and this is 4 years ago, I'm trying to think about this in history and predicting the future. If he doesn't win a non-consecutive term, and he's not Grover Cleveland, would he be Millard Fillmore, who ran on the American Party ticket after not getting a second term and ran with the Know Nothing Party and lost? Or would he be split off from the Republicans and then just continue to run as an also ran, as sort of a third party or minor party? Well, we know the answer. He became Grover Cleveland. And if he grows a mustache, we'll know for sure that he's Grover Cleveland.
We need to do a program on Harold Stassen. Drop the points.
I want to come back to this this alternating, because the series of one-term presidents is something that we really haven't seen since the Grover Cleveland era, and I think that's a really interesting question. But I want to stick with the economy for a second, partly because Gian has been doing a lot of thinking and some good scribbling on this. So Gian, you know, in the polls, Trump led consistently from the get-go as being better trusted by most voters on the economy, first than Biden and then than Harris. She never caught up to him. She started closing ground, but never caught up to him. And yet many economists said that we had achieved a soft landing, right? There's real economic data that says that things may actually have been better than 4 years ago, and yet people didn't feel it. So was it that the economy wasn't that bad, or it was just perceived to not be bad?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really
Or
fascinating.
perceived to be bad.
Yeah, an important question, because it captures so many of the cross-cutting factors in this election. And my quick take is that the perception is the key, and a little more complicated than that, it's how class shapes that perception of economic performance. Let me explain what I mean by that. By, most of your conventional economic measures, we really did have a remarkable comeback from the pandemic recession. Gross domestic product, employment recovering, even the inflation was relatively, as Barbara said, constrained in historical terms and relatively brief, and we ended it without going into a recession. So in a technocratic sense, yeah, this was really should have been a win. But I think what was forgotten, and it's fascinating that it was forgotten by a president who was in the Senate in the 1970s, is how devastating inflation is in political terms, and also how it cuts so differently across class dimensions. The thing about inflation is that it's immediately visible to people. Every time they go to the gas station, every time they go to the grocery store, every time they want to buy, a new device or whatever it might be. And the closer you are to the economic margin, the more dependent you are on a monthly budget, the more you feel that. And here's the other way that this cuts in and class goes sort of both directions, is that Harris's support was really skewed towards college-educated voters. And in very broad terms, the college-educated are more affluent, hence they're more insulated from exactly those kinds of impacts, those very immediate, month-to-month, week-to-week impacts of inflation. So there's an insulation there that it's not as much of a priority for those who have that kind of economic position. The other thing is that the inflation coming out of the pandemic occurred on top of another crisis that goes back at least to the Great Recession, and that's the affordability crisis. That the cost of key areas of life, housing, healthcare, childcare, education, has all been going up, really skyrocketing for the last 10 to 20 years. And no one has found a solution to this. And we can go into the details, but the Democrats have some vulnerability beyond just being the incumbents on all of those issues. So and again, those are affecting lower income people to a much greater extent than they do the college educated. It affects everyone, but the fewer resources, the less of a cushion that you have, the more you're hit by all of that. So it created a vulnerability. And then the final factor that I see on the economy is that the Biden administration's messaging on this was absolutely terrible. They really dropped the ball on communicating to the public about the inflation crisis. Some of that was, I think, simply Biden's broader inability to communicate as he had a degree of decline related to age. I think that's just the blunt reality of that he wasn't messaging very well on any of the administration's accomplishments. He was not doing the persuasive element of the presidency that, this is one of the first things that when you study the presidency, you understand, is that there's the policy side, there's the decision-making side, but there's also getting out and talking to the public. And he simply was not effective on that across the board, whether we're talking about Ukraine or the legislative accomplishments. Really very little of it. But the specific messaging on inflation was particularly problematic, that it tended to be very dismissive. This isn't really a problem. It's worse in Europe. It's just supply chains coming out of the pandemic. All true, but of absolutely no relevance to the person in the grocery store every week. And not only did it have a condescending quality and a dismissive quality to people's real concerns, but it created a perception that the administration's priorities were elsewhere. And quite specifically on some of the social and cultural issues where public opinion was also shifting against a perceived, and sometimes it's perception rather than reality, but a perceived Democratic position on those controversial sets of issues. So I think it's that way that we see culture and class intersecting with and cutting across economic factors that really explain the way the economy created that strength for Trump, that Harris was never really able to separate herself from the administration and create a clear economic message to counter that view that she and her administration were simply weaker on that issue than Trump.
So again, let's stick with that for a second, particularly the loss of non-college educated voters up from the Democratic column. Over 3 elections, we saw Trump's vote share grow. His first election in 2016, I think he got about just under 46% of the vote. It grew to 47, and this time 49.9. It's come down below 50% as the tabulations from California and Oregon continue to come in. So we're seeing growing support. Is it too soon to say that it's a realignment? Is it a realignment? How do we think about that in broader structural political terms?
Yeah. My answer to that is that it's not yet a realignment, but it has the makings of a realignment. We've already talked a lot about the college-educated, non-college-educated dimension, but we're seeing it in the crudest measures of class 2, of income. Trump won every income bracket below $100,000. Harris won everyone above $100,000 and increasingly strong above $200,000. You see also, even beyond those kind of income and straight class measures, you see a movement to the right across a range of groups, especially famously Latinos, but also Asians, to a lesser degree blacks, and young people, which is kind of fascinating. We heard a lot about young men, but in fact, young women actually move slightly to the right, not as much as young men. The gender dimensions of this are fascinating. It's probably something we can get into. Somewhat misunderstood, I think. So you do see, I think, the makings of a potential new coalition there. If Trump and his successors can nail that down, because I do think you really need to have a true realignment. It needs to be replicable across more than one leader. But the outlines of this are clear, that you see an electorate that's depolarized on racial and ethnic lines, and one that has a sort of broad working class, multi-ethnic, multiracial coalition on the Republican side, along with, interestingly enough, some of the very wealthy sticking with it, and then a potential Democratic coalition that's essentially the college-educated and kind of a remnant set of minority groups that are to one extent or another still with the Democrats. Now, is this going to stick? I think there are a couple of questions. This is something the Trump administration can absolutely screw up, okay? We're talking about these margins, and I want to be clear, you know, these are not big shifts that are going on in some of these specific groups. When you look back to 2008 and 2012, Latinos in particular, it gets pretty noticeable. So I think there is something really there. But a lot of these other differentiations, particularly when we go back even to income lines, it's a couple of points. You know, it's something that's pretty vulnerable. So a lot of things that they can do wrong. They can simply overreach. We talked about historical echoes. Another one is the 1994 midterms, obviously not a presidential election, but a sweeping Republican win, which was rapidly undercut by overreaching on the part of Newt Gingrich and his cohorts, along with scandal and corruption.
And
so
2018 in that regard.
absolutely, yes, more recent example. So that's one part, just going too far on some of these issues that, yeah, maybe the hardcore MAGA crowd wants, but a lot of these more marginal voters who went with Trump because they thought he was better in the economy actually don't want to see, say, mass deportations, or pick your issue, prosecutions of Trump's enemies. They can overreach very easily. They can also simply be bad at what they're doing. This was obviously a huge problem in many areas in the first Trump term. So the question then, too, is do they develop a positive agenda beyond simply kind of reacting to these resentments and some of these hot button issues? Do they go in the direction of some of the things that, say, J.D. Vance has talked about, or you know, an Elon Musk, you know, techno-libertarian dynamism kind of agenda? Lots of vulnerabilities, though, for the Democrats, though, too. They have many structural weaknesses, I think, particularly in the way the party, such as it still is a party, functions in relation to some of the interest groups and advocacy groups that exert a lot of influence on policy, but actually what we saw in this election is they can't really deliver votes in the way that they claim to. So short answer is, I think, you know, maybe the forces are there, but it's not solidified.
So this is what's so great about these conversations, is that, you know, we plan them out and Bill has these great questions, and then he says, but if you think of something while we're talking, go ahead and say it. So what just occurred to me, what Guy was saying, there's a parallel with inflation. Yes, inflation went down, but did people feel that it did? Is this a realignment? Does it just feel like a realignment, or is it really a realignment? So Guillen is absolutely right that, you know, political scientists will say it has to be replicated and it has to stick. But what occurred to me as you were saying that was that we political scientists look back at 1932, the first Roosevelt election, and say, well, realigning election, you know, massive majorities of Democrats in the House and the Senate. But it just occurred to me, he didn't get the Supreme Court. Famously, he was, first of all, no one left the Supreme Court in the first 4 years of the Roosevelt presidency, and I always say he was praying each evening for someone to at least retire, if not pass away. But they just wouldn't go anywhere. And so famously or infamously, he put forward this court packing plan, which didn't go anywhere. But my point is, he didn't have the Supreme Court until well into the second and third terms, when he was able to have these people, well, first of all, the court began to switch its votes. but also he was able to replace people, ultimately put all 9 people on the bench. Richard Nixon, we sometimes think about, oh, was that a realigning election because of his Southern strategy and his appeal to the South and his law and order message of 1968, and saying, I will change the Supreme Court. It's been too pro-criminal rights with the Warren Court and the issues of race. And he did. He put Warren Burger in the Chief Justice seat, and he appointed 3 others. But there's a book that was popular in the 1980s called The Burger Court, The Counter-Revolution That Wasn't. And so he didn't, in a way, have the court either. But that's what feels to me like certainly a movement towards realignment, is that you have, by small margins, president of one party, House and the Senate by one party. And while I always hate to apply party labels to the court, we know that the court right now has a majority of conservatives and seemingly is pro-Trump.
And when we're speaking about small margins, remember what the numbers were with all those battleground states that Trump ended up winning. You know, in the blue wall, it's 1.5% or less. I mean, that's really small, and here we are.
Similar to 60 and 68.
Right.
Very similar.
I mean, very
small margins.
So in the others, in Arizona, in Nevada, it was larger than that, and arguably Trump still would have won the Electoral College had he, had Harris won the blue wall and Trump prevailed in the others. But it would have been a lot closer, and the conversation about realignment would have been a different kind of conversation.
But to Barbara's point of President winning not just the presidency, but both houses of Congress, we've seen this in every president since Bill Clinton. But to Guillen's point, we've also seen, with 2 exceptions, setbacks in the first midterm. The first being Bush, because it was post 9/11. The second being Biden, where he did lose one house of Congress, but by very small margins. So and in that case, the public did not read Biden as overreaching, or if they did, I think they perceived the threat of Trump to still be out there. By the time the election rolled around in 2024, the threat of Trump somehow or another seemed lower. Barbara, I want to come back to you about VPs. So in the sports stat sheet of presidential election, sitting VPs running are now under 500. They're 4 out of 9.
That's right.
Why is that? Why is it, if incumbent presidents typically do well, why do sitting vice presidents not do well? Why was she more like, if I can remember the 5 losses, Breckinridge, Nixon, Humphrey, Gore? Why is she on that list? Why is she not on the Adams, Jefferson, Van Buren, Bush list of sitting VPs who win?
Right. Well, the other thing that I love about the Miller Center is that we get time to, in addition to doing our programs of recordings and oral histories, which we love doing and we're hired to do, Bill makes sure that we have time to do columns, or Guillen's written this brilliant essay on just what we're talking about today. So back during the campaign in the fall, I published with Newsweek, Can Kamala Harris Overcome the VP Curse, is what I called it. And Bill has indicated why it's called a curse, particularly in the modern era. I look at the 3 that you mentioned were more in the post-founding era. So something has changed. And so what I did was point out those who had won and who had lost. Some of them, like Richard Nixon, lost in 60, but then he went on as a former vice president to win in 68. But why is it that it's so hard, and why did I call it a curse? So I came up, if you will bear with me here, 5 reasons that it's a curse. One is sometimes the vice presidents are tarred with the same brush as the president, particularly if there's a bad economy or there's a perception that there's a bad economy. Oftentimes they're associated with perceived failures of the president, sometimes with scandals of the president. In the case of Al Gore, it wasn't that Bill Clinton was so hurt by the Monica Lewinsky scandal. In fact, the more Ken Starr attacked him and the Republicans went on to try to impeach and convict him, the more his popularity and approval ratings went up, along with Hillary's as the First Lady. But Gore felt he would be tarred with that brush, so he didn't want to go out on the campaign trail with Bill Clinton, and that probably hurt him, caused him to lose his own state of Tennessee, which, by the way, Grover Cleveland lost in 1888, his own home state of New York, for somewhat different reasons. Lack of support from the president himself for the vice president. Famously, Eisenhower was asked in the 1960 race if he could cite, he was asked by the press, could he cite a real contribution that Nixon had made? And he said something like, if you give me a week, I could come up with something.
Actually gave him 2 weeks, I think.
2 weeks?
Maybe it was 2.
2 weeks, he asked for 2 weeks. Now,
That feels like a student asking for an extension on a paper, I have to say, this time of year.
And I'd always say, of course you may have an extension. That's 1 letter grade off per day that I extended. So in a way, I think that Nixon was losing each day that Eisenhower was trying to think of something that he could say to the press. A reluctance to break from the president. We've talked about 68 and Hubert Humphrey, and certainly Kamala Harris ran into this. Now, I was hearing this as a positive about her. Wasn't it great that she was so loyal to President Biden as he was going through this period of decline leading up to his choosing to get out of the race? But people were saying, maybe it will hurt her, but what a loyal person. And she remained that way, really, and almost like Humphrey until the very end, and then tried to put some distance between her. And then finally, the reasons for the selection of a vice president will often be very different from what people want as a president as opposed to what a president or a presidential candidate wants. So remember why Kamala Harris was picked. Who can name the reasons? Color, gender, California. So she, and youth, much younger. Would be then the first woman vice president. So all of those reasons that Biden chose her for 2020 and that I'm sure helped and bolstered the ticket were not necessarily the reasons. In fact, Guillen points out really well in this essay, things like DEI, which worked against Democrats this time around. When she was first brought forward after Biden said this summer he was going to step out, he then said, I'm going to endorse her. Immediately, it seemed, the Democrats jumped on that bandwagon. And what did Republicans say immediately, including members of the House and the Senate? She was a DEI appointment to the vice presidential candidate slot in 2020. So those very reasons that she was chosen may have been very positive in 2020 turned out not to be so positive. So those were some of the reasons I came up with about the curse.
Yeah, I would just say that not only is there a reluctance to break, and we've seen that, and interestingly, I did see a report this week in which it seemed as though the Biden camp gave Harris the opportunity to distance herself if she wanted to, but she chose not to do so.
Yeah, there'd been some conflicting reporting on that, but you're right, it was a pretty definitive statement.
That's going to be fat when we do the Miller Center oral history of the Biden administration. That's going to be certainly something to pay attention to. But you also have, at times, the president actively working against the candidate. And we go back to 1968, and you're right, Hubert Humphrey eventually did break from LBJ. He does so at the very end of the campaign, September 30, gives this taped address that appears on TV in which he says, contra LBJ, I would move forward on an unconditional halt to bombing. And that's not where Johnson was at all at that point. And Johnson was really livid, gets on the phone, gives Richard Nixon some advice on how to counter some of Humphrey's positions. Apocryphally, we hear that Johnson said, because of that, I'm going to make sure that all your funding west of the Mississippi dries up. So, we suspect that Lyndon Johnson, because of Richard Nixon's posture on Vietnam, would have been okay with Nixon winning for that reason. I mean, there would have been others not so. But you have this real tension at the top, and I think it was manifest in 1968 in that way.
Sort of interesting is that Humphrey's viewed as the happy warrior, and that Kamala Harris was viewed as the joyful warrior, and that almost their personas they're positive and loyal.
And remember, it was a different time too, because Richard Nixon offers Hubert Humphrey the ambassadorship at the United Nations. Humphrey turns it down, but here's an opportunity to reach out across the, right, we're not seeing it now, but in different era, there was an effort to try to unite the country after these divisive moments. And it's just a fascinating side note to history.
Mark, I want to stick with foreign policy, but before doing that, want to invite you all, please, to share your questions. After my next question, and Mark will start taking them from the audience. We have a student with us today, Jolena, in the back of the room. Raise your hand, please. Raise it high. Stand up. Please share your questions with Jolena, and our online viewers, please use the Q&A chat function on your screen to submit your questions, and we'll get them in. Mark, foreign policy, we saw it in this election. It was the chaos in the world, the concern on the left of losing student voters like in '68, the Afghanistan withdrawal by the Biden administration, and the 14 service members who lost their lives at the airport in Kabul. We've seen this before, though. We've seen presidents wounded by foreign challenges, and a sense that a fresh start with a new president might help. Other than '68, if you're looking across presidential election history, what else comes to mind?
I think you can go right back to World War II and point to each election and not necessarily say that foreign policy was determinative, but you can say that it certainly intruded. I mean, the era that we study, in particular 1960, JFK running to the right in many ways of Richard Nixon on foreign policy and succeeding partly as a result of that. Of course, then getting boxed in because of the rhetoric that he uses on the stump. Forward into '64, we've already spoken about '68, but '64, Johnson's able to defang Barry Goldwater on the matter of Vietnam by August 1964, a couple months before the election, deciding on a get tough maneuver off the coast of North Vietnam as a result of these attacks on American shipping in the Tonkin Gulf. So it intrudes, and I think you can point to that throughout time. But like other moments, it's really the most consequential thing. Think of James Carville in 1992. It's the economy stupid, and it usually is. And it was this time as well, of all the issues that voters were responding to, as far as we can determine from the exit polls, which are themselves in a way problematic. Foreign policy was pretty far down the list. I mean, you have inflation, you have the economy, you have the border, immigration, you have reproductive choice. Foreign policy is at 4%. Right? That's the level to which that's the level at which people were responding to the foreign policy concerns when they went into the voting booth. But it does shape our elections in many ways, and I think in some respects 2024 is a good example of that. Bill, you'd already mentioned the withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021, the servicemen who died. It was a real black eye for the Biden administration, which had approval ratings at that point hovering around 50%. I think it was around 49% at that point. A month later, it drops to 43%, and then it continues to crater, and it never really recovers. And that moment, August of 2021, is really kind of before and after for the administration, at least as far as approval ratings, but also I would think competence, because it's a matter that it's an issue that Biden had run on. Think of, again, where we were in late 2020, the Trump administration and its handling of the pandemic, and reports coming from, I think it was Deborah Birx, who said, White House advisor on COVID, those first 100,000 deaths as a result of COVID, nobody would have been able to do anything about that. No president, no sitting administration could have done a whole lot about that. But after that, yeah, you could start to chalk those up to the Trump administration, and the issue of competence is really important. I think the issue of competence arises as a result of Afghanistan in 2021. And the other major foreign policy concerns, I think, also intrude in many ways on this election. Ukraine. The Biden administration eventually assented to whatever those weapons systems the Ukrainians ultimately wanted, but didn't do so at the time for fear that it might provoke the Russians. hardly a peep in many ways as a result of finally coming through on those. I think now we're in a stalemate. We've heard more people talk these days about the possibility of trading land for Ukraine membership, which for NATO membership, which may be a possibility. We're in a stalemate, and Donald Trump is able to point to that and say, you know, this has been going on for way too long. The numbers, if you look in the country, more people are dissatisfied with the American posture than not. Trump can certainly point to an America First agenda and say this is all part of that. So there is a consonance there that seems to ring true, and other issues as well. Gaza. The Biden administration, as we've already alluded to, ran into some really tough going and had to position itself. Yes, certainly it was going to be supportive of Israel, as other administrations have been, but it ended up, and Biden and then ultimately Harris ended up paying a consequence for that. Certainly if you look at Arab voters in Michigan, potentially even Democratic voters, Jewish voters in Pennsylvania, although I've seen different studies of how that shakes out. Pennsylvania itself, Josh Shapiro, right? It's conceivable that had the administration selected Josh Shapiro, had Harris selected Josh Shapiro as her running mate, they might have had a stronger ticket. But there's real concern about that, what that might mean, especially to the younger cohort, those on the left, and what that would mean for the vote in November. So again, it's not determinative, but it's out there in the ether and affects people's perceptions.
Ian?
I just want to build on that point that Mark made about the consonance kind of across all of these foreign policy issues and the question of competence. And I think it links in an interesting way to the domestic as well, that there's a degree to which at least maybe less engaged voters see global disorder under Biden, and they perceive the same thing at home. It's the order disorder issue, and you can critique that viewpoint and what's accurate and what's not, but there was a broad perception, whether it's crime or the homelessness crisis, a whole range of things within the United States where that feeling of order breaking down lines up with the broader perception of the way the global situation is.
Yeah, and to circle back to what I had said at the outset regarding 68 and 2024, you have these global disruptions in the streets in 1968. You had half the countries in the world essentially go to the polls in 2024. 80% of the incumbents either lose entirely or lose their majorities, and it is that sense that there's this lack of competence, a lack of faith in leaders. I think there's a demographic dimension to that as well. 68, you have the youth vote emerging into political maturity. People who were born 1946, 1947, they're in the streets, they're on the college campuses, they're raising a ruckus. It looks like things are coming apart. Same here, the post 9/11 generation that has had to live through, at least in the United States, certainly Afghanistan and Iraq and what that meant to, but more broadly, the Great Recession, the disruptions as a result of the Arab Spring, Syrian refugee migration crisis, and the impact that that's had on Europe, and then finally the pandemic itself and the disruption that that's led to. So all of these together, I think, has led to a sense of let's throw the bums out.
So, and when Guillen talked about competence, I'm reminded of the connection between the domestic economy and a chaotic period and some foreign policy failures of the Carter administration. We haven't mentioned that, and we're going to be doing an event early in the new year looking back at the Carter administration, which many historians look back quite favorably on because they had big legislative accomplishments. They laid the seeds for, particularly through Paul Volcker, of raising interest rates to bring down inflation that took a year or two to take, happened under Reagan, and hands over a number of situations that start resolving themselves. As I'm watching the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, it feels a lot to me like the end of the hostage crisis in Iran just before Carter hands over to Reagan and takes one more thing off the plate of the new president. And speaking of Carter, there are two questions from the audience that I think resonate with that period. One is, who is the best person to be spokesperson for the Democratic opposition in the next 4 years? And the second is, a simple explanation is that the national platform of the Democratic Party was to the left of the average voter. Please comment, right? The Democrats feel like they may be going through a post-Carter period here of figuring out how we get this back. Post-Carter took 12 years to figure it out. So I'm curious to get your take on what does this mean for the Democratic Party moving forward?
Well,
and where have we seen other periods in history where a losing party has gone for a walk in the woods to try to figure out where they go and what they do next?
Let me take the question about the voice of the Democratic Party. Nobody over the age of 65, period, sorry. It's got to be a younger generation. I don't know who it is. I think the good news for the Democrats is there's a talented bench. I think particularly in the governors, few people in Congress as well, although I think maybe a little less so there. But yeah, to the second question about the perception of the Democrats moving left, there's a fascinating survey done by, I think it was Third Way, that asked voters to rank how, on a scale of 0 to 10, the two candidates being very conservative, very liberal, and then themselves. And Harris was about a 2.6 or something. Trump was about a 7.8, and the average voter was about 5.6. And so that really captures, I think, a lot of the perception problem that Democrats have. And interestingly, I think it's the same study, maybe it was a separate one, but there was one, actually this is a different group, but looked at what Democratic voters actually list as their priorities versus what all voters think are Democratic voters' priorities, and there was a striking gap. So that a lot of the hot button culture issues were much higher in perceptions of Democrats than they actually were ranked. So there's a massive problem here for the Democrats, I think, in managing these kinds of perceptions. Gets back to some extent to the messaging points we've already talked about, but I think there's a structural issue here too, that the Democratic Party in Washington is very responsive and really very intertwined with a whole series of interest groups and issue advocacy groups that have very strong views on a whole range of issues. And we saw this, for example, early on with immigration, that a lot of the Latino advocacy groups had a very, very strong position that essentially an unrestricted immigration policy was both morally right but also politically wise. And there was tension within the administration. There's been some good reporting just in the last couple of days on this, of some of the senior people saying, well, wait a minute, maybe this is actually going to produce a political backlash, even among Latino voters. But you had people who had come into the administration, even out of those groups, some of the groups doing polling for the administration, taking a very traditional kind of 2008, 2012 coalition of the ascendant, emerging Democratic majority kind of an argument that no, Latino voters care first and foremost about immigration policy. And this is being pushed really by the advocacy group. And you see this repeated on a number of the controversial issues. As I said before, these groups shape
immigration for a second.
Yeah.
Have we seen, one of the questions from the audience is, has a surge in immigration previously impacted a presidential election in a major way? I saw in the paper today that this may be the greatest surge, this last period of immigration, it may be the greatest surge in immigration since the early 1900s, in over a century. So I don't know if we, sticking with immigration, have we seen the politics of immigration be so central in a presidential election before?
I don't know that it's really been this central, honestly, where it was, I guess, the second issue behind the economy. It's been a factor, certainly, in elections. So there was a significant wave of focus on it in the 90s, but never one that quite drove election outcomes this way. If you go earlier to the early part of the 20th century, leading up to the immigration restriction acts of 20 and 24, it's a piece of those politics, but there are other things going on in the elections leading up to that. So, you know, one of the things I think when we talk about with history is just like, no, sometimes it's actually different. And I think this is the case.
Yeah, I mean, it really is an extraordinary.
And I think you're right about that. We have had a surge that it's higher than the 1890s, according to that. I read the same analysis. It's very striking.
What's also striking to me about it is that the economics of immigration, the politics of immigration in retrospect seem obvious. Trump ran on it.
Yeah.
Democrats didn't have an effective answer. He won a lot of votes. The economics of immigration seem complicated.
Very complicated.
Right? Because it seems to have actually helped fuel economic growth.
Absolutely.
And the question of whether or not a restriction in immigration might actually raise prices, which cuts against the other thing
absolutely
that
does.
helped Trump win. So I'm curious, do other people, are people following this issue in the same way?
I would be hard pressed to say it was a central issue back in these times that we're discussing of 1920s and then in the latter part of the 19th century. But I noted in Guillen's essay and reading it last night that it's true that the know-nothings, for example, never gained national power, but they were a powerful third party. And they had a lot of local power in that they would elect mayors, they would have publishers of newspapers, and they would then foment and support riots against Irish Catholics, German Catholics in states like Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, my home city of Louisville. 100 Irish and German Catholics were killed in the 1850s when the Know Nothing mayor and the Know Nothing publisher of the local paper got these riots going. They were attempting to burn down Catholic churches and tenements of Irish and Germans.
Right, so it might not affect, or hasn't affected the elections perhaps as much as it does to now, but it certainly affects the texture of life. Yeah. And it affects the way we think about who we are and what we want to be. You know, who's a real American? I mean, these issues have often come with a backlash, a nativist backlash, that is coarsening to American life, and it's posed a real challenge going forward. And
it tees up a great question here, the one that we've all discussed. What will it take to break the grip of us against them in America? You know, how we've talked about how a new president, how presidents in the past have tried to unite the country, whether or not President Trump chooses that as a pathway forward. What are some of the things that we've seen in the past where presidents, when faced with deep division, have tried to say, okay, let's pull this all together?
Well, so I want to get to that in a second, but I also wanted to kind of tie it to some of the issues that Guillen was talking about with respect to the Democratic Party and messaging and language and interest groups, right? In many ways, there have been, and certainly during the Trump years forward, 17 forward, a maximalist approach to issue purity, right? How should we stand against a variety of concerns that we have, actions that the Trump administration took and may well take? And you think about the slogans such as defund the police or abolish ICE. And in thinking about the kind of people who can unite the party, who may be the next spokesman for the party, who can bring the country together. We're a center-right country, and I think we've been so for a while, and people self-identify that the liberals are lowest on the pecking order of conservatives and moderates. And I think there needs to be somebody who is able to, you know, going forward, spokesman for the Democrats, oppose on principle and moral issues when appropriate, but at the same time, make sure that the country functions effectively so that we can get big things done, and we have to get big things done. Now, how do you make a nod to the other side if you're the sitting party to do this? We have talked about this before. There are a variety of ways. You can invite a member from the other party into your cabinet. Doesn't look like that's going to happen. You can make...
Other than Tulsi Gabbard.
Let's just look out.
Just saying.
Anybody buy that? Well,
RFK Jr. in a sense too. I mean, there's a sense that there's a disaligned part of what was once part of a Democratic coalition that doesn't trust big institutions.
Right, but if you think about the other kinds of Republicans that have been brought into Democratic cabinets, they didn't need to transform in any way or shed their bona fides or leave their party. They remained. I mean, think about
Chuck Hagel.
Well,
Ray LaHood, we just interviewed here in this room last week. Ray LaHood, a longtime Republican congressman from Illinois. The head of the Department of Commerce and doled out the money from the stimulus around the country.
Particularly in an election that was won by, 1.5 percentage points when Trump, I don't even think he officially got to 50%, like 49.
49.9 right now.
49.9, 49.8, something like that. In the past, when they have been super close like that, it's been recognized that you make a nod to the country. JFK brings in these super Republicans into his cabinet as Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense, populates his White House with other Republicans as well to indicate, I think we're all in this together, also to protect himself. It was another era. And it's going to be, I think, a real challenge to get back to that kind of unifying force.
One real quick point.
Quick point and one last question.
Yeah. I think we've seen the last 20 to 30 years a series of sweeping policy failures across a range of areas that have discredited a lot of our kind of political establishment and our institutions. And I think the challenge and really the answer ultimately, and I don't know exactly how this is to be done, is to defend institutions that are necessary but have been shown to be very flawed without defending the status quo. That's the window that has to be walked through.
Here's a question that might align with that or might not, partly because of the way the question's written. Can you comment on Musk and campaign finance in this election? And let me go to it in this way, in the way that it might connect, but feel free to comment on campaign finance. Mark and I have been having an exchange about CEOs who have been brought in before, right? The biggest one that comes to mind is Robert McNamara. Are they establishment or not establishment? Musk was a disruptive CEO, right? He was not a legacy car company. He was from scratch, not to mention SpaceX and his other ventures like buying Twitter, turning it into X. He had formerly been thought of to be as a Democrat, particularly because of the association with electric cars and climate change and the like. So I'm just curious, the DOGE effort goes at this, right? The thing that he's heading up is, in the Clinton administration, we had reinventing government. This is reimagining, dismantling, doing all kinds of things with government that we've never seen before, including taking $2 trillion out of the federal budget, which is kind of hard to. So I'm curious how you all are viewing Elon Musk with 2 minutes to go. How about a lightning round of 30 seconds on Elon Musk?
All right.
Elon Musk family photo, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, no, it is. I don't know if I have two. Yeah, lightning round. I see a real tension between Musk and the kind of J.D. Vance vision, first of all. At least J.D. Vance in the sort of more economic populist line. Because I think what Musk and Ramaswamy are trying to do is to look in a futurist kind of a way, and I say that with a very critical sort of view of past efforts at futurism, at a period where we are facing rapid change, starting with AI, but also energy and all kinds of disruptive forces. They're trying to get ahead of that. I'm not sure that the mechanism of DOGE is one that they will succeed at. I'm not sure their vision is right to begin with, but to move from a sort of unofficial commission or whatever DOGE is to actually pushing changes in the structure of the federal government through on a widespread basis is really, really hard. There are a lot of points that they're going to have to hit. So yeah, disruption, and Musk has a fascinating track record, but I don't know if they quite understand the world they're now operating in. But we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong.
Barbara, DOGE is Department of Government Efficiency.
that isn't really a
That
department.
isn't really a department.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think of the Doge's Palace in Italy. So I will just say the most recent and maybe the last time we will have bipartisanship on campaign finance was McCain-Feingold Act that passed into law, and then via Mitch McConnell's bringing a case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is why he cares so much about the Supreme Court and views campaign finance as free speech. We know that the court struck down the McCain-Feingold law. And then you add Citizens United to that, and we are where we are. So I don't see any kind of bipartisan agreement on that or change, I'm sad to say.
Yeah. I would just say the impulse is not misguided, but the devil's in the details, and the extent to which an extra governmental organization whose resources we know not, but they'll be able to self-finance, of course. I think, again, the impulse is okay, and you've even heard people from the other side, the left, say it's not wrong to put a microscope on all of these operations of government. But again, the changes need to be administered with a scalpel, really, and not with an axe.
Well, with that, I am so appreciative, first of all, for all of you. We've had a really great year here at the Miller Center. It's been a complicated year, not just with the election, but with so many things going on at the university and in the world. And the one thing that I feel great about in this year is the community that has helped build the Miller Center. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary. You'll hear me say this a lot in the coming year, but this place is built entirely on philanthropy. And we're really blessed in that regard because we've been able to bring the community in and have the community own this organization while still being very much driven and our agenda set by this group of scholars and the other scholars affiliated with the place. We're particularly appreciative of our governing council. A number of governing council members are here with us today. We couldn't do this work without them and their guidance and stewardship. And then finally, to the faculty and staff here at the Miller Center, this is a first-rate group, as you all know. I'm struck by our growing online attendance that the rest of the country and the world are getting to know that little by little every year. And so a final thanks to Mark, Barbara, Gian, Russell, who's not with us today, and who co-runs the oral history program. These four, plus Christina, who runs our public programming, are the full-time faculty of the Miller Center. We have some others like Melody Barnes and Maura Rudman and Chaz Richard, who are also faculty members here, and then faculty scattered across the university. It's what makes the Miller Center so special. So thank you all. Have a happy holiday, and we'll see you on January 13th, 2025.